Okay, afternoon everybody. My name is Mary Neville. I'm a Customer Success Director here with Aprimo, so I work with lots of customers across the region. And I'm delighted to be here with Gareth today to talk about end user adoption. So, really, I'll just talk a little bit about the theory, what we see and what we recommend across customers. And it's great then that Gareth is actually going to talk through some of the real life examples of good user adoption practice, really. Okay, but before we start, we're delighted to speak. We're not so pleased to have been given, the graveyard shift after lunch, but maybe lunch wasn't so big. So in the past, people tried to do something clever, like get people up and dancing. We did talk about it, Gareth.
We did.
We did, and we did even try to do the floss and realised neither of us were particularly coordinated. So we did bring some dancing cats instead. So this is the kind of end user adoption dance as far as we're concerned. On a housekeeping basis, I think some of you guys are chasing after headsets, so you're looking for some hidden, subtle session codes. So keep an eye out. You might spot the session code. I can see Peter there is entering it in up on the leaderboard. Brilliant. Okay, so without any further ado, I get asked a lot with customers, how do we actually prepare for end user adoption? But the answer to that question really is certainly prepare in the beginning, but what we're finding is as the workplace evolves, how you deal with it has maybe subtly changed over the years. And one of the things we notice is the marketing teams themselves have changed a lot over the last 10 years in some respects, in that individual teams are now more likely to be agile, cross-functional, and certainly there seems to be a lot more power with individual teams. So the users in those teams, they expect to have high-quality information. They're very passionate, and they expect and want to learn from each other, not just from the top down. So the new generation of marketers, they not only welcome change and innovation, they actually expect it. And we need to accommodate them and their new learning styles. But we've been realistic, despite this change, some things haven't changed the same. There are other real users out there that we all see every day. Whether it's people who are excited, which is good, but overly excited about the wrong things, maybe not so good. Rebels, people who want to do it their own way. They don't want to kind of come into line with a common process. People who are really just, best we can say is they're dreaming, they're not really based in reality. Okay, or worse, people like the gentleman in blue, people who are just missing in action. So we have to realize that adoption has to cope with all these types of characters as well. But we did have a chat about what the perfect user is, because that's eventually what we want to get to, lots of perfect users. So system administrator might say the perfect user is the one they never see because they're not hassling them looking for information and support. But really, as far as we're concerned, the perfect users are the ones who will work together and will work towards common goals and challenges. But more importantly, there has to be evidence. So how they behave with the system has to translate into data that can be picked up on reports and shared with management. So where do we see people start? So it's very simple. Really, in the beginning, you have to know your goal. If you're going to evolve user adoption, always know what the next goal is that you're trying to achieve. And try and keep it as simple as possible. So as few goals as possible, but goals that are achievable and measurable. And one of the key changes over the last few years is that it's no longer the case that user adoption happens once. You deploy a project, it's hopefully successful, you sail into the sunset. Absolutely not. If you're going to have innovative teams, your processes are going to change. How the business works is going to change. The technology is going to change. Most of our customers now are on SaaS platforms, so there's capabilities arriving literally on a bi-weekly basis. And all of that has to be communicated in a meaningful way to end user teams. So just some very quick hints and tips from an Aprimo viewpoint. What we see is that the customers who've got successful user adoption strategies in place are people who think about all three of these pillars. So, normally people are very good at actually focusing on, practical training and enablement. How do you use the system? What do you click on? What happens next in the process? How do you upload content? And that's great and it's necessary. But if you do that in isolation, without really having thought through what are we trying to achieve by deploying this technology and communicating that strategy to users, you're not going to be successful. Okay, and then the third pillar sort of sounds obvious, but sometimes it does get mixed, is you need to have a good day-to-day operational model in place because, again, user adoption is going to evolve over time. And if you don't have a team in place who's going to manage that for you, then you're limiting your opportunities to be successful. So what we say is, really we always recommend that people embrace the change and embrace new capabilities by allowing people to access new capabilities as early as possible, by communicating it and encouraging feedback. We would rather hear, and a good system deployer like Gareth would rather hear something bad than hear nothing. Okay, if you hear something bad, we can improve it. What's equally important is going back to the fact that people like to learn from their peers. It's also important to give people the opportunity to share their own success between teams. So certainly, activate and test new features, but we can't emphasize enough the importance of communicating early, before anything changes, and then continuing to communicate as often possible. So hands up, how many people log on to Aprimo Academy? Okay, few hands, that's great. So some materials which you'll find on Aprimo Academy, we've got an adoption readiness checklist, not going to read it here. Download the tactic, it's freely available. Okay, second piece of guidance is, whatever you do for user adoption or anything else in the system, it's always important to prove what you've done. So we can't emphasize enough that, a key part is how are you going to know if your adoption has been successful or not if you haven't decided what does successful adoption mean to you. So again, we'd encourage you to track your adoption metrics. Because data, after all, data is your friend when it comes to convincing users. Because if you don't manage it, the grapevine will. The grapevine is always active. Now, it can be good, it can be bad. It can be someone who's very proudly saying that my team is the best, they get through more work than anyone else. It can be a little bit negative, the legal team over there take absolutely ages to review, and that's why everything is backed up. But, grapevine is fine, facts can't be argued with. So, yeah, maybe your team, is better than everyone else because they've done substantially more projects provable by what's been automatically captured in the system. But actually, reviews don't really take ages. They take an average of 1.2 working days. Okay, unless they're supposed to, of course, take 1.2 working hours, in which case the person probably did have a good argument. So again, on Aprimo Academy, if you want more examples of metrics to track, please download our free guide from the Academy. A few other words on how to communicate with users. Absolutely leverage what you've got. So if you use Slack internally, piggyback on that and use it. I've had customers who get very clever, with games. So one of my other Scottish customers had a 12 days of Aprimo in the run-up to Christmas with exciting gifts like Aprimo t-shirts and other such items. And again, keep learning fairly short and snappy. So use lunch and learns, use podcasts, anything you can that will get to your users. Okay, again, final piece of information on Aprimo Academy I'd encourage you to look at. We've got lots of these, but if you're looking for suggestions on lunch and learns, podcasts, again, just do a quick search. You can download the sample documents. So the key takeaways from me before I hand over to Gareth is, the workplace absolutely is changing. It's really key to have a ongoing program in place, which will track and measure user adoption. Okay, and pretty much theme of our sessions over the last few days, user adoption, like everything else, is something that has to keep evolving. Okay, and I'm going to hand over to Gareth because I think what you'll find is the theory is great, but absolutely fantastic to have someone who kind of does this in practice on a daily basis. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Mary. Okay, so my name is Gareth Benny. I am the Marketing Systems Manager for Prudential. So I've been in the role a number of years, and I have been through 2 implementations of Aprimo Marketing Studio, one of which was the original implementation back in 2013, and the second one was the introduction of the SaaS platform. So Prudential implemented the SaaS platform to replace an earlier version of the software. Now, the earlier version of the software that we implemented in 2013, we faced quite a number of adoption issues from our user community. Now, the reason, or partly the reason for that, is the business at the time had went through a few restructures. Now, there's never a good time, I guess, to land any kind of project or system, but it was a particularly tough time for the business when we decided to go ahead and roll out the original project to implement Aprimo Marketing Studio. Now, with that, I think there is a degree of, you can go into survival mode sometimes when that happens, and you just try and get through the project. So as a result, our communications out to the users suffered. So, for example, we're always communicating through Outlook, and it's just basic emails. It's all very corporate. You know, I work in the financial services environment, so you can imagine the dry content that goes out, that sort of thing. Now, that's all very well and good in the corporate industry as a norm, but when you work in marketing operations and your audience are marketers, that's actually really tough when you just communicate to them, you know, just in a basic form through email. You know, there's nothing eye-catching there. As a result, we had quite a difficult implementation, quite a difficult launch, and then a lot of hard work ahead of us to kind of turn the perception of the system and our team, it has to be said, around to get things working for us. Now, hindsight is a wonderful thing. There's a lot of things we would have done differently. However, when we implemented SaaS in 2018, it gave us the opportunity to do all the things that we originally maybe should have done or wanted to do. So what we did, we just have a look at the next slide. There we are. Over 2018, we actually increased our engagement quite significantly with our user base. So we have around about 150 odd users. So there's quite a lot of training involved, and then a lot of BAU work went in after it once the system had launched to keep momentum going with all the users, to keep engagement levels up, to keep interest in the system, and almost try and create a bit of a buzz around it. So when we first launched Aprimo SaaS, so the first thing we did is we wanted to communicate to the users that there was a project on the go, that sooner or later the system was going to change. So rather than just put a standard email out, what we did was we did an infographic which basically let the users know what Aprimo SaaS was, or we called it version 10 for a while. And in Prudential, we give a summary of what was going to be involved. There's the details of the project, how was it going to be managed, you know, what did it mean for the users who had projects in situ, would they be transferred over, all that sort of stuff. There was a bit on revenue and cost, you know, why are we doing this? There was a high-level timeline as well as the project outcome, you know, what were we trying to achieve, who was actually involved, so who was the project team. As you can see, we've got myself in the middle there. Thankfully, the design agency liked me, so they weren't too harsh. So that got us off to a good start. So right away, there's, you know, a nice infographic. It got people paying attention to it, sat up and took notice. So right away, you're off to a good start, and people are thinking, oh, this new SaaS platform seems like it could be a good thing. Then once this was out of the way, that's when the hard work begins. So there's a whole implementation, which, you know, Aprimo handled for us, but internally we've got training materials to build, communications, you know, how are we going to actually get this live with the users? So what we actually did is we we got our users involved in the designing of the training material because ultimately that's going to support them through the duration of the period of time that they're actually working with Aprimo SaaS. So what we did is we got a design agency to draw up some concepts of landing pages, the actual meat and bones of the training material, some of the more kind of high-level slides that explains what each user's role is in the business, all that sort of stuff. We hired out a room. We put all the concepts on the walls. We had music, food, that sort of stuff, all the kind of things marketeers lap up. We got them in, and when we got the stuff back from the design agency before we actually had the kind of session with the users, you always have a feel this is what the users will go for, and they'll probably pick X, Y, and Z. And we were actually wrong on a couple of accounts, which was quite interesting, so I'll touch on that in a second. This is kind of what the front-end interface of our training material looked like. Now, this was actually produced on PowerPoint, and as you can see, each tab was a hyperlink. So rather than printing off, like 500 sheets of paper and saying, there's your training material, like you would have done in 1996, for example. These are all hyperlinked. So if you wanted to see, for example, a digital process, you obviously just click digital process and it takes you straight to the training for that. What we did was, even though it was produced on PowerPoint, we saved it down as a PDF, which retained all the hyperlinks, and it actually operated like a website. So it was like a cheap little way of building a website for us. Didn't really cost us any money to do. On to the next slide. Was something we presented to our marketeers as well. So it's basically, there are 4 types of users in the MRM system. Here they are. We've got asset owners, system admins, reviewers, and we even branded the super user, as you can see, with a little superhero there. So what we presented to our marketing team was 4 or 5 different versions of that with different colours, different tone of voice, different layouts. So this is the one they went for. The next one is quite interesting. So the actual meat and bones of the training material, the one that actually says, click this button to move here, or whatever you're doing, whether you're starting an activity or in a project, etc. This is what the users picked. So we had this mustard colour, we had baby blue, and I think we had white that all were presented to the marketeers. And when we first got that one back from the design agency, I was a bit like, oh, okay, we'll maybe just stick that one in just to fill a bit of space. Although this is the one that the marketeers actually picked. Now, the reason they picked it was they felt it stood out from the rest of our brand. Everything else that we did was more on brand. This one seemed to jump out the users a bit more, and it was a clear identifier that this is our internal communication. It's for us and us only. It's not, customer facing. And I guess they just liked it because it was a little bit different to what they were used to on a daily basis. Surprised us, to be honest. As I said, it was kind of put in there to make up the numbers, but there you go. You can never anticipate what your users actually want, as crazy as it sounds, but there you are. Now, what we also did is, before we officially launched and went live with SaaS, is training was rolled out to each department via recorded WebEx. So rather than having people sitting in a training session for 4 hours, etc., we had done a series of short WebExes, just giving the information that they needed with a bit of Q&A. What we also did is we recorded the WebEx and converted it to MP4. So that meant the users, when they went live, they had the training deck that they needed online, but they also had a recorded video that they could watch and play back at any time. So there was a clear, I guess you're covering all bases because everyone has different training needs. When we were ready to launch, what we also got input from our users was we created some merchandise to, desk drops, that sort of stuff, just to try and create a little bit of a buzz when we went live with the system. So doing all of that stuff, I think, enabled us to have quite a smooth transition with the users onto the new SaaS platform. They felt engaged. Everyone knew what it was doing. When we went live, it was very smooth. We had no real issues, to be honest. And, it couldn't have actually went any better. Now, we'll have a look at the merchandise. So this is what we produced. Our marketeers picked this as well. We had a bit of a football theme. Make sure Miriam is on your team. Now, Miriam is our colloquial name for Aprimo Marketing Studio. We had water bottles, desk drops, pads, posters, all that sort of stuff that our design agency threw up. I think our print team actually gave us these for free, so it didn't actually cost us anything, which is always nice. Now, from a BAU perspective, once you're out of that project environment, you then need to keep momentum going with the system, because what you'll all have is incremental changes that go along. So what Prudential do is we run a monthly podcast on all things Miriam or Aprimo Marketing Studio. So anytime a significant or even a minor change is made to either Miriam or Aprimo Marketing Studio or the marketing process in general, we include that in the monthly podcast. So typically a podcast will be no more than 30 minutes long. Sometimes it's even shorter than that. And what we sometimes do with our super users is before we record the podcast and put it out there, is we let our super users know what it is we're going to be discussing and talking about, because that can preempt some questions, and it means they can support their team, right from the off, because they've had kind of prior knowledge to what was actually going to be rolled out. Now, some of the things that we do in our podcast, for example, as I said, it doesn't always necessarily need to relate directly to the system. As the last podcast we rolled out, we had a couple of new extended attributes that we built in to the workflow that we wanted to talk the users through and explain what they were for. But we also, in Prudential, we've got a tool where we can capture dynamic web content. So rather than having a web asset as screenshots of an asset and then screenshots of each show hide carousel, we've got a tool that just pulls it directly, keeps it as a snapshot in time, and we upload that to Aprimo Marketing Studio. So the last podcast, for example, we discussed that as well as the attributes as well. And we generally find that the podcasts are very popular. Users like to dial into them, so much so that you sometimes get other areas of the business trying to hijack it a bit and say, oh, can you talk about this in your podcast? Because we know people dial in. And you've kind of got to keep that discipline and just ensure that it doesn't blow up. What we've also got is another thing I'm going to touch on, is we have something in Prudential called a marketing support centre. So what we've got essentially is users, whether you're marketing, in fact, anyone in the Prudential business can access the marketing support centre. That has links down the right-hand side, you'll see them, so creating great communication. So if users need to see what our brand guidelines are, they can just go in. What processes to follow. So if you've got a financial promotion, how do you get it signed off? And within that, as explained, you will need to use Aprimo Marketing Studio. This is how you get access to it, that sort of thing. It's the same with getting published. How do you publish an item? Well, that item has to be signed off in Marketing Studio, then it goes live through Adobe Experience Manager. And we've also got a change log, so anything that's changed process-wise, system-wise, you'll be able to find it in there, so there's a clear view of that. Now, as I said, the entire business of Prudential has access to that. So as someone mentioned earlier about people having a misconception that all marketers do is sit around and draw all day. At Prudential, we can categorically provide evidence that that's not all we do. Everyone can see that. And just to wrap up, there's just one other thing I want to touch on. What we also do is we analyse how each team is performing with Aprimo Marketing Studio by assessing the types of query that we get into our mailbox. So we've got an Outlook box. It's called Miriam Support. If a user has an issue with it, they can email us. And we've got a team, obviously myself and one of my colleagues, will troubleshoot and go back to the users, that sort of thing. Now, we do actually provide a little bit of MI on that. It's all very high level, but what it's designed to do is on a monthly basis, we'll look at, perhaps which teams have emailed us the most to see if there's a clear pattern. All right, this team, for some reason, has, emailed us 20 times in the last month. There's clearly an issue here that we need to deal with. What we then do is we break that down further and actually have a look at the type of issue that we've had. So for example, and it's just an example, I've said, right, okay, there's a clear spike in single sign-on issues for some reason. So what we can do is we can actually make that the subject of our next podcast and talk about that and say, this is how you avoid, the pitfalls of X, Y, and Z. Or we can even pick up with that team directly. The key thing about this is we don't use it as a stick to beat people with. It's more of an educational piece. You don't want, even with a podcast, you don't want to go in heavy-handed and say, this team have raised a problem. Why are you clicking on this button? You shouldn't be doing that. You need to just, tone of voice is important for that sort of thing. Make sure the message is always positive. Users will buy into it. And that's basically our journey that we've undertaken in the last maybe year and a half with Aprimo Marketing Studio, just to try and raise its profile in the business, make sure that our marketeers are fully bought into it. Now, it has been successful, so much so that other non-marketing teams are now looking to use Marketing Studio for the sign-off of content, basically. As our business is rapidly changing, what we're actually finding is the way marketing operates and the kind of quick sign-off times and things like that we have is actually expanding throughout the business. So it's an interesting time for us, so we really need to keep the momentum going on that. Now, I'm going to hand you back to Mary just to conclude. So thanks for listening to me, folks.
Thanks very much, Gareth. You know, and I can definitely say that everything you've done, you know, is to see it in theory and action, and it's certainly appreciated by the Prudential users. So we even had an anecdote about a user leaving Prudential to go and work in another customer in Scotland who also uses Aprimo in a slightly older version. And the first thing they did on day one was say, "This isn't as good as Prudential." So yeah, and that, you know, that's all, I guess, thanks to you and the team. So thank you very much. Thank you, everyone.